Multiculturalism was inspired by a book by John Murray Gibbon published in 1938. It was called Canadian Mosaic: The Making of a Northern Nation. It challenged the American ideal of cultural assimilation known as the melting pot. Subsequently, as Québécois nationalism grew and also cultural diversity across the country, the Royal Commission on Bilingualism and Biculturalism recommended multiculturalism. As we have seen, the Official Languages Act was adopted in 1969 by the Trudeau government, and multiculturalism 2 years later.
English and French received official recognition in the Constitution of Canada in 1867. But as we have also seen, this recognition was incomplete in various respects and has often been a matter of dispute with regard to French. If we agree on the principle of equality, then the equal status of the two languages must be affirmed unambiguously. What is implicit must become explicit.
In 1971, official multiculturalism was adopted. Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau introduced it as a policy of multiculturalism within a bilingual framework, a policy that would complement the Official Languages Act by facilitating the integration of new Canadians into one or both of the official language communities. Although there are two official languages, there is no official culture, said Trudeau. A Canadian philosophy, it asserted that individuals, especially immigrants, could adopt the culture or tradition of their choice rather than assimilate into the dominant culture and still be just as Canadian as the next person. These ideals will celebrate its 50th anniversary next year. The policy has two main goals: help cultural groups foster and retain their cultural identity and share it with others, and 2, help cultural groups fully participate in Canadian society. The concrete measures that flowed from this included financial support for ethnic and immigrant organizations, the funding of ethnic studies at universities, official language training and programs that aided ethnic minorities in obtaining full human rights. The policy was further legitimized when ethnic groups successfully lobbied for the inclusion of a clause in Canada's Charter of Rights and Freedoms recognizing Canada's multicultural heritage. A comprehensive study of why this happened is included in Chapter 3's lesson materials. In 1988, the Progressive Conservatives passed the Act, and yet funding for multiculturalism was cut back in the 1990s in order to help reduce Canada's deficit. There was also criticism that the policy was having the effect of undermining the development of immigrant attachments in Canada. Here the textbook refers to Neil Bassoon-Dath's 1994 critic, Selling Illusions, The Cult of Multiculturalism in Canada, as an important example of this point of view. The focus shifted more to reducing barriers to participation, finding employment, housing, education, fighting discrimination. Then more emphasis was placed on promoting Canadian values such as democracy, freedom, human rights, and the rule of law. Currently, supporters of multiculturalism argue that it helps immigrants to feel more welcome and they feel a stronger sense of belonging in Canada. Critics of multiculturalism argue that it has encouraged immigrants to isolate themselves in their communities, and it opens the door to human rights violations, women's rights in particular. In Quebec, a concern is that the encouragement of immigrants to retain their cultural identity, which dilutes the French nation and weakens the status of francophones. Overall, polls indicate that the proportion of Canadians who are concerned about whether or not immigrants adopt Canadian values are slowly decreasing. 51% say that immigrants do not adopt Canadian values, down from 72% in 1993. And 43% disagree with the statement, up from 23% in 1993. You can watch the full debate after this narrated slide presentation. Immigrant integration. Not to be confused with assimilation, integration is the extent to which an immigrant becomes a contributing member of the host society. Economic integration is gainful employment commensurate with educational levels. Political integration is participation in electoral processes and other forms of political engagement. Social integration is participation in Canadian institutions. Cultural integration is learning about Canada's values and norms. Until the mid-1900s, immigrants were responsible for their own integration. Since then, the government and many NGOs have stepped up to provide everything from language classes to support for finding employment and housing and information on community services for everything from education to healthcare. The textbook points out that Canada can be proud that its immigrants do better than immigrants in most, if not all, other Western democracies. Immigrants in Canada have better educational outcomes, and they earn more than second generation and more Canadians. Neighborhoods with immigrant communities in Canada don't feature the same levels of poverty and social isolations as ghettos in major American or European cities. Evidence points to multiculturalism as playing an important role in the results. This is so important because 1 in 5 Canadians are foreign-born. As we have seen, though, immigrants remain vulnerable. They are more likely than Canadian-born to be chronically poor with low incomes for 5 years or more. Visible minorities are more likely to experience higher poverty than whites. Also, we tend to choose highly educated and skilled immigrants who end up with their knowledge and skills entirely unrecognized. They become unemployed or underemployed in low-wage jobs. In terms of political integration, immigrants to Canada are more likely to become Canadian citizens than immigrants to other Western democracies, and more foreign-born are elected to Parliament. There is no evidence that Canadians discriminate against foreign-born candidates. While it is true that the proportion of immigrants and visible minorities elected to the House of Commons is below their presence in the population, it is also true that, to be fair, if the proportion of visible minorities who are citizens is the benchmark, then visible minorities have achieved close to parity in representation.